December 17, 1944. 0630 hours. Ligne-Neuville Crossroads, Belgian Ardennes. The morning fog clings to the frozen earth like a burial shroud. Private First Class William Martinez stamps his boots against the cold, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. His checkpoint duty should be routine, checking papers, verifying unit designations, waving through the endless stream of American vehicles retreating from the German offensive that began yesterday. But something feels wrong. A jeep approaches through the mist, its occupants wearing American uniforms, speaking perfect English. The sergeant in the passenger seat flashes a winning smile. "Cold morning, soldier. How about those Yankees?" Martinez tightens his grip on his M1 Garand. It's the question that shouldn't need asking. Not here, not now. Every GI knows the password protocols, but this is different. This is the new test, the one whispered about in mess halls and foxholes since yesterday's chaos began. "What's DiMaggio's batting average?" Martinez asks, his finger finding the trigger guard. The sergeant's smile falters for just a fraction of a second. "Well, .325, wasn't it?" The wrong answer. Joe DiMaggio hit .357 in 1941. Every American boy knows that. Martinez raises his rifle as the Americans reach for their weapons. The morning erupts in gunfire. This scene played out dozens of times across the Ardennes in December 1944. American soldiers suddenly found themselves questioning everyone and everything. Your buddy from the next foxhole over? He might be a German commando. That officer giving you orders could be one of Otto Skorzeny's infiltrators. In the largest American military disaster of the European theater, paranoia became a survival tool, and knowing Ted Williams' hometown or Babe Ruth's record could mean the difference between life and death. The mastermind behind this psychological warfare was SS-Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite commando. Standing 6'4", with a distinctive dueling scar across his left cheek, Skorzeny had already become legendary for rescuing Mussolini from an Italian mountaintop prison. Now, in Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and recapture Antwerp, Skorzeny had been given his most audacious mission yet, Operation Greif, or Griffin in English. The plan was deceptively simple and terrifyingly effective. Skorzeny would train and deploy Brigade 150, approximately 2,000 German soldiers who would wear American uniforms, drive captured American vehicles, and spread havoc behind enemy lines. They would misdirect traffic, change road signs, cut telephone wires, and spread false orders. Most importantly, they would create such paranoia that American forces would spend more time checking each other's identities than fighting the actual enemy. At the Führerbunker in October 1944, Hitler had personally briefed Skorzeny on the mission. The Führer's eyes gleamed with the old fire as he outlined his vision. Commandos who could pass as Americans, who knew American slang, who could quote baseball statistics and name Hollywood starlets. They would be the vanguard of confusion in the Great Offensive, turning the Allies' diversity and open society into weapons against them. At Grafenwehr training camp in Bavaria, Skorzeny faced an immediate problem. Of the 2,000 volunteers who answered the call for English-speaking soldiers, fewer than 10 could actually pass as Americans. Most spoke textbook English with heavy accents, knew nothing of American culture, and walked with the rigid bearing of Wehrmacht soldiers. Skorzeny had 6 weeks to transform them into convincing GIs. The training was unlike anything in German military doctrine. In makeshift classrooms, instructors, including a handful of former German-American Bund members who had lived in the United States, taught lessons that would have seemed absurd in any other military context. How to slouch like an American, how to chew gum while walking, how to eat corn on the cob. Germans traditionally cut the kernels off. The way Americans held their cigarettes between index and middle finger, not between thumb and forefinger like Europeans. Unteroffizier Günther Schultz, a former exchange student who had spent a year in Ohio, became the culture instructor. He drilled his students relentlessly. Americans say gas, not petrol. They ask for the John, not the WC. When you count on your fingers, start with your index finger, not your thumb. That's a dead giveaway. The men studied American radio programs, memorized popular songs, learned to identify American vehicles by their sound. They practiced American military protocols, the casual salute, the way GIs wore their helmets tilted back, the peculiar American habit of keeping hands in pockets. They studied maps of American hometowns they'd never seen, memorized the names of commanding officers they'd never met. But it was the baseball that proved most crucial and most difficult. Schultz would burst into barracks at random hours shouting questions. Who won the '43 World Series? What position did Lou Gehrig play for the Yankees? Name 3 teams in the National League. Those who hesitated or answered incorrectly faced extra drilling. One commando later recalled spending entire nights memorizing statistics he didn't understand about a game he'd never played. The equipment gathering was equally challenging. Skorzeny needed authentic American uniforms, weapons, and vehicles. Through various channels, captured equipment, raids on supply dumps, or even items taken from POWs, they assembled a modest arsenal. But there were never enough proper uniforms. Some commandos would have to make do with partial American kit mixed with German equipment painted olive drab. They only had 15 Sherman tanks, 30 armored cars, and 30 trucks, far fewer than 50 tanks Hitler had promised. On December 14th, as the commandos prepared to deploy, Skorzeny gathered his unit leaders. Remember, you don't need to be perfect Americans. You only need to be convincing enough in the confusion of battle. Create doubt, spread fear, make them question everything. That is your weapon. The first teams crossed into American lines on December 16th, hidden among the massive artillery barrage that opened the Battle of the Bulge. Dressed as American MPs, engineers, and infantry, they slipped through the chaos of the retreating American forces. Team leader Wilhelm Gerstner, posing as a lieutenant, successfully directed an entire American regiment down the wrong road, sending them miles from their intended defensive position. Another team removed road signs at critical crossroads, turned others in wrong directions, and created traffic jams that lasted hours. By December 17th, word of the infiltrators had spread like wildfire through American lines. At the 99th Infantry Division headquarters, Colonel James Rudder received reports that seemed impossible. American jeeps firing on American positions, MPs giving contradictory orders, road signs that led units in circles. Then came the captured commando who broke under interrogation, revealing something that sent ice through every commander's veins. Some teams had orders to assassinate Supreme Allied Commander Isaac D. Eisenhower. The revelation transformed standard security into suffocating paranoia. At SHAEF headquarters in Versailles, Eisenhower found himself virtually imprisoned by his own security detail. Military police surrounded him constantly, his travel was restricted, and a body double was even employed for public appearances. The supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, the man coordinating the movements of millions of soldiers, was trapped in his own headquarters because of a few dozen Germans in American uniforms. But it was at the countless checkpoints throughout the Ardennes that the real drama unfolded. American soldiers developed increasingly elaborate tests. Knowing the capital of Illinois wasn't enough. You had to know the name of Frank Sinatra's first wife, what position Mickey Cochran played for the Detroit Tigers, who won the 1940 Rose Bowl. Brigadier General Bruce Clark of the 7th Armored Division was stopped at 3 different checkpoints in 1 hour. At the third, a nervous private asked him what league the Chicago Cubs played in. Clark, exhausted and irritated, snapped, "American League." The wrong answer nearly got him arrested at gunpoint until his aide vouched for him. Even authentic Americans were failing the American test. The paranoia reached absurd heights. At one checkpoint near St. Vith, Master Sergeant Raymond Phillips watched 2 GIs argue for 20 minutes over whether Betty Grable was married to Harry James or George Raft. Both were legitimate American soldiers, but neither would let the other pass until a lieutenant who knew the answer, Harry James, arrived to resolve the standoff. Captain James Cobb of the 106th Infantry Division recorded in his diary, "We've gone mad. I saw a colonel detained for 2 hours because he couldn't remember who played center field for the Cardinals. Men are being shot at for pronouncing Chicago with too much emphasis on the Ka. We're spending more ammunition on each other than on the Germans."
The commandos, meanwhile, continued their work. One team, led by Oberfeldwebel Heinz Rode, managed to operate for 3 days straight. Posing as engineers, they removed demolition charges from bridges the Americans planned to destroy, misdirected supply convoys into German hands, and spread rumors that Patton had been killed and Montgomery had been captured. Rode spoke perfect American English, having lived in Chicago for 5 years before the war. He knew the Cubs played at Wrigley Field, could quote Jack Benny routines, and even complained authentically about Army food. But for every success, there were failures. Gefreiter Wilhelm Schmidt's team was caught when they stopped for fuel, and Schmidt made the fatal error of forgetting American vehicles had their steering wheels on the left. Another team was exposed when they marched in perfect formation. No group of American GIs ever walked that precisely. Small mistakes, cultural tells that no amount of training could overcome. On December 19th, near the Meuse River crossing at Dinant, Technical Sergeant Tony Calvino had developed what his unit called Calvino's Baseball Inquisition. The son of Italian immigrants from Brooklyn, Calvino had grown up in the shadows of Ebbets Field and could recite Dodgers statistics back to 1920. His checkpoint had become legendary and feared among American and German forces alike. "You on through?" Calvino would say, his Thompson submachine gun casual but ready. "Tell me who started Game 3 of the 41 series for Brooklyn." When a supposed American lieutenant couldn't answer, it was Freddie Fitzsimmons. Calvino's men searched the Jeep and found German cigarettes hidden under the seat. The 3 Americans were actually members of Einheitsstielau, one of Skorzeny's most elite teams. But Calvino's system wasn't foolproof. When Major Robert Sterling of the 82nd Airborne approached, exhausted after 3 days of combat, he failed to remember who managed the Boston Red Sox. Sterling, who had spent his entire life in rural Oregon and never followed baseball, found himself under arrest for 4 hours until his identity could be verified through division headquarters. "I told them I didn't give a damn about baseball," Sterling later wrote, which apparently was the most un-American thing I could have said. The cultural test had become a double-edged sword. At the 2nd Infantry Division command post, intelligence officer Captain William Hartley compiled a list of failed challenges. A genuine American chaplain who didn't know what GI stood for. A tank commander from rural Alabama who had never heard of Jack Benny. 3 engineers from an all-Negro unit who were detained for hours because the MPs couldn't believe black soldiers would know Glenn Miller's songs. They knew them all. Meanwhile, Skorzeny's commandos were adapting. Unteroffizier Karl Weiss, who had worked as a waiter in New York before the war, successfully passed 12 checkpoints by adopting a Brooklyn accent and aggressively complaining about everything: the weather, the food, the officers, the Germans. "Americans love to complain. The more you gripe, the more American you sound," he had told his team. His team operated for 5 days, cutting telephone lines and spreading false intelligence about German paratroop drops. The most audacious infiltrator was Oberleutnant Gunther Schulze, who not only spoke perfect English, but had actually attended UCLA for 2 years in the 1930s. Posing as a lieutenant colonel, he arrived at the 1st Infantry Division headquarters, claiming to carry urgent orders from Schaeff. He knew Tommy Dorsey's entire discography, could name every World Series winner since 1930, and even corrected a sergeant who misquoted Bob Hope. For 3 hours, Schulze gathered intelligence on troop positions and supply situations until a sharp-eyed clerk noticed something odd.
The colonel had signed a requisition form with the date written in European style, 19.12.44, instead of 12/19/44. In the ensuing confrontation, Schulze wounded 2 MPs before being killed trying to escape. The paranoia was affecting combat operations. Units refused to move without extensive identity verification. Commanders spent hours confirming orders were genuine. At one critical junction, 2 armored units sat idle for 6 hours, each convinced the other was a German force, while the actual Wehrmacht slipped past their flanks. By December 21st, the American counterintelligence had developed more sophisticated detection methods. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Hayes of the Counterintelligence Corps had noticed patterns. The infiltrators' boots, though painted black to match American footwear, still had German hobnail patterns on the soles. Their dog tags, while perfect copies, used slightly different zinc alloys that felt different to the touch. Most tellingly, when asked to write anything, they invariably made their number 7 with a crossed line, a European habit, almost impossible to break. At Malmedy, where the SS had massacred American POWs on December 17th, the hunt for infiltrators had taken on a vengeful intensity. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, who had lost his brother in the massacre, established what troops grimly called O'Brien's Court. Every suspect was forced to strip to their underwear. German-issue undergarments were a dead giveaway. They had to write the alphabet in cursive. European and American styles differed markedly. They had to make change for $1 without hesitation, to demonstrate how to throw a football, to light a match with one hand the American way. One of Skorzeny's best teams met their end through the smallest detail. Led by Feldwebel Hans Richter, they had successfully operated for 6 days, their English flawless, their knowledge of Americana comprehensive. But when they stopped at a field kitchen for hot food, Richter made a fatal error. He held his fork in his left hand and knife in his right while eating, European style. The mess sergeant, a former restaurant owner from Chicago, noticed immediately. The entire team was captured within minutes. The intelligence haul from captured commandos was invaluable. Under interrogation, Gefreiter Peter Muller revealed the communication codes used by infiltrator teams. Another captured commando, facing execution as a spy, provided details of Skorzeny's headquarters location, leading to targeted artillery strikes that disrupted German coordination. But the operation had already achieved much of its psychological objective. General Omar Bradley himself was detained at a checkpoint when he incorrectly identified Springfield as the capital of Illinois. It was actually the capital, but the nervous MP thought it was Chicago. Bradley later wrote, "The greatest weapon Skorzeny employed was fear itself. Half my staff was afraid to leave headquarters, convinced every jeep contained assassins." The paranoia reached its peak on December 23rd, when military police, convinced they had cornered a high-ranking infiltrator, surrounded a house in Ardennes. After a tense 4-hour standoff, they discovered they had trapped Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who had been trying to coordinate with American forces. Montgomery, with characteristic British hauteur, had refused to answer questions about baseball, declaring the entire exercise absolutely preposterous. As Christmas approached, the American forces had largely contained the infiltrator threat. New protocols were established. All vehicles would carry special daily recognition codes, units would exchange liaison officers who could vouch for identities, and intelligence teams would conduct regular sweeps. The 150th Brigade's effectiveness was waning as more commandos were killed or captured, and those still operating found it increasingly difficult to move. Skorzeny himself never crossed the lines, contrary to rumors that swept through Allied ranks that he was personally leading an assassination team to Versailles, that he had been seen in an American general's uniform. The SS colonel remained at his command post, coordinating what remained of his scattered teams. By December 26th, he received orders to withdraw the survivors and reform as a conventional combat unit. The unraveling of Operation Greif unfolded alongside the broader collapse of the German offensive. By Christmas Eve, knowledge of infiltrators had saturated American ranks, and commandos found it increasingly difficult to function. The initial confusion, so deeply planted by Skorzeny's teams, was giving way to collaboration between U.S. intelligence units and frontline troops. New detection methods, some as subtle as observing how a soldier counted on his fingers, others as technical as checking serial numbers on dog tags, tightened the net. Units grew less reliant on baseball trivia, reverting to standardized military protocols, yet the shadow of suspicion lingered in every interaction. Skorzeny's hopes of paralyzing the Allied advance had yielded days of chaos, but the offensive itself stalled. American resistance grew more organized, as exemplified by defensive stands at Elsenborn Ridge and Bastogne. With their disguise rapidly losing effectiveness, most infiltrator teams attempted to return to German lines or abandon their missions altogether. Those unlucky enough to be caught behind enemy lines often faced summary investigation and, for some, execution. The international rules of war, codified in the Hague Convention and accepted by U.S. military courts, dictated severe punishment for combatants fighting in enemy uniform. Several commandos were court-martialed within days of capture and executed before the year's end. Post-war tribunal records show at least a dozen received death sentences. Their story, chilling in its mix of cunning and tragedy, ended in anonymity in a frozen Belgian field. Yet the intelligence gained from these captures was significant. Interrogations yielded maps, radio codes, and insight into the scale of German tactical deception. One captured commando provided information on Skorzeny's command post, facilitating artillery strikes that further disrupted German coordination. Another revealed the signal system by which infiltrators marked safe supply routes, an intelligence windfall that proved crucial as the Allies began shifting to the offensive. The psychological dimension also played a role. As Skorzeny's men recounted their training, U.S. intelligence analysts quickly developed countermeasures. Subsequent field manuals would warn not just of enemy uniforms, but of cultural fluency tests, emphasizing that knowledge of American customs could be faked. Despite these gains, the infiltration campaign achieved only its secondary aim: delaying, sowing uncertainty, stressing the bounds of Allied trust. The dream of seizing bridges over the Meuse and splitting Allied lines proved impossible. By December 26th, the German attack was stalling everywhere. General Patton's Third Army reached Bastogne, ending its siege and pushing German forces back. Skorzeny, operating from relative safety behind his own lines, received orders to consolidate his battered brigade. His men removed their American uniforms, rejoined regular Wehrmacht formations, and soon faded into the chaos of retreat. For many American soldiers, the weeks of paranoia left lasting scars: trust tested, identity verified in foxholes, and fear of friendly fire, a psychological toll as indelible as material loss. The denouement of Operation Greif and the Battle of the Bulge provided a rich vein of lessons for military planners and historians alike. The operation itself, ambitious in conception, if limited in effect, revealed the immense challenge of cultural infiltration and the critical power of everyday knowledge in wartime. The idea that a simple baseball question could expose an impostor echoed in military folklore, shaping American counterintelligence doctrine for decades. The farcical, sometimes tragic detention of actual Americans for failing the baseball test stands as evidence of both improvisation and its pitfalls. For Skorzeny, the legacy was both notoriety and legal peril. In the ensuing years, the Allied authorities would put him on trial for wearing enemy uniforms in combat, a crime for which death was a possible sentence. The U.S. Army War Crimes Tribunal at Dachau, though, ultimately acquitted Skorzeny, persuaded partly by the Allied use of similar secret tactics and the lack of proof that the infiltrators fought in disguise instead of merely infiltrated. Nevertheless, most of his men had met tragic ends in the confusion of late 1944 and early 1945. On the Allied side, the experience prompted procedural rigor in identity verification, prompting innovation not just in passwords and badges, but in the use of daily recognition codes, liaison officers, and robust documentation practices. The tension and mistrust generated by Operation Greif, though fleeting in military terms, underscored the vulnerabilities of even well-equipped armies to psychological warfare. Military historians reviewing the battle years later recognized Operation Greif as an audacious gambit, strategically visionary but tactically flawed, and ultimately unable to stave off the inexorable advance of the Allied armies. The enduring image from those frozen days in the Ardennes is one of ordinary soldiers, alert, suspicious, and burdened by uncertainty, finding certainty not in uniforms or ranks, but in the easy knowledge of sport, family, and American pop culture. The baseball question, immortalized in stories and memoirs, captures a truth about national identity that no enemy uniform could ever disguise. In the grand sweep of the Second World War, it remains a testament not just to vigilance, but to the ties that bind a citizen army in defense of home and democracy.